I had this dream, a dream about a theory, and it's very close related to the quantum mortality, but it kinda is my own version. You could say it's a mix of quantum mechanics and personal survival, multiversional branching, and subjective immortality. At first I wanted to call it the Schrödinger's consciousness, inspired by Schrödinger's cat paradox, but applied to awareness and survival. But then I decided to go with So if you need something to listen to or want to explore your own mind and thoughts about what this could be, then welcome to my life and my thoughts from one simple little dream. What if you could never die? Not in the sense of immortality as we usually understand it. No magic potions, no technological singularity, no supernatural forces at play. Just simple, unbreakable, unshakable continuity. What if, no matter what happened, you always find yourself alive in some version of reality, stepping seamlessly from one existence to the next and never experiencing an ending? This is the eternal step theory, the idea that from your own perspective, you will never truly die. Even in the face of certain death, your consciousness will always shift to a version of reality where you survive. You may not even notice that this is happening. You might just wake up one day in a hospital bed, walk away with a minor scar, or in some cases, never even realize how close you came to the end. But the version of you that did die, that is actually someone else's reality and not your own. So let's begin with a simple experiment. Imagine that you're crossing the streets and suddenly a truck barrels towards you. In one reality, you don't make it, but in another, you trip just in time and fall backwards onto the pavement as the truck zooms by. The eternal step theory suggests that you will always experience the latter. From your own perspective, you will always continue in the timeline where you remain alive, even if it defies probability. Now, take this further, apply it to every close call that you've ever had, a car that narrowly missed hitting you, a disease that you somehow overcame, an accident that almost took your life. And what if there is a reason you always find yourself on the path where you live? The many worlds' interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that every possible outcome of a situation branches into a new universe. Every decision, every random event splits into the infinite possibilities. If this is true, then for any life-threatening event, there will always be some universe where you survived. And crucially, your consciousness, your ability to observe reality only continues in those timelines where you are still alive. In short, if you're reading this, congratulations, you never died. And according to eternal step theory, you never will. But wait, what if this were true? Why do we see others die? Every day, we hear about people passing away, loved ones, celebrities, historical figures, all lost to time. If they experience the same reality as we do, shouldn't they also be immortal in their own perception? Now here it's where it gets a little tricky. The eternal step theory proposes that while you always experience survival, others around you are a part of the branching multiverse that you inhabit. Their experience of reality is their own, just as yours is unique to you. When someone dies in your universe, their own consciousness has simply moved to another timeline where they survived, but you remain in the one that they did not. It's a paradox of perspective. To you, they are gone. To them, life has gone on without interruption. It's just in a branch you are no longer a part of. This means that from each individual standpoint, they are always on the timeline that leads to their survival, even if it's invisible to everyone else. Now, how likely is it that you keep surviving? One of the biggest challenges to the eternal step theory is probability. If the idea is true, that means that every time that you were supposed to die, there was always at least one reality where you survived. But at what point does survival become so improbable that it challenged the whole idea itself? For example, if you were in an event with a 1 in a billion survival rate, is it really likely that you keep ending up in a branch where you lived? The odds of dodging death continuously may seem absurd, but the probability alone does not refute the theory, because no matter how improbable, if a single survival branch exists, that is the one that you will always experience. We often think of luck as something random, but quantum physics suggests that reality itself behaves in a way that allows for infinite outcomes. If reality constantly branches into multiple versions of events, then survival in even the most impossible situations have at least one path forward. Imagine flipping a coin 100 times. Normally, you'd expect a mix of heads and tails, but if infinite versions of this experiment exist, then somewhere there is a reality where you land heads every single time. It may be ridiculously rare, but in one timeline, it happened. Your survival follows the same principle. Even if something is highly improbable, it only takes one possible version of reality where you make it through. And from your perspective, that's the one you always experience. If someone jumps out of an airplane without a parachute, how could they possibly survive? Eternal step theory suggests that some obscure but possible event must happen to allow survival. Perhaps they land in an impossibly well-placed net that miraculously saved them. Maybe an updraft of air slows their fall just enough to keep them alive. A freak weather event cushioning their landing. While these events are unlikely, they are not impossible. And according to the theory, consciousness follows the surviving version of reality, no matter how implausible. A pressing question remains: if survival always happens, can this continue indefinitely? Or is there a point where all the path eventually leads to death? What if you reach an age where your body is beyond repair? What if there are no physical possible branches left where you continue? Does the eternal step theory collapse at this final moment, or does survival take on another form? Now, welcome to my theory. If this sounds interesting, then here is where we go very deep into it. So, if the eternal step theory suggests that we never experience our own death, why do we witness the death of others? Why do we mourn lost loved ones, read obituaries, and watch history unfold with figures passing into memory? The answer lies in perception. According to the theory, every conscious observer follows their own uninterrupted survival path. While you experience a continuous reality where you never die, others follow their own trajectory. When you see someone die, it is merely an indication that their conscious perception has diverged into a different branch of reality, one that no longer overlaps with your own. Imagine two rivers splitting at a fork. The moment of divergence is death from your perspective, but from their perspective, they simply continued along a different path. While you remain in the world where they have perished, they themselves do not experience this loss. To them, life carries on as normal in a branch where they survived, just as you do in your own version of reality. Despite the implication of eternal step theory, our emotions remain deeply tied to the concept of death. We feel loss, grief, and fear because in our branch of reality, the deceased are no longer present. But if we would accept the premise that their consciousness has continued elsewhere, does this change how we could perceive death? Some may find comfort in the idea that no one truly experienced an ending, and others may struggle with the notion that the deceased are not truly gone, but merely inaccessible from their own perspective. This raises further questions. If every consciousness follows its own undying path, what does that mean for relationship? Do we ever truly share the same existence, or are we each merely passengers in a reality tailored solely to our personal survival? One unsettling consequence of this theory is that, in the deepest sense, we may all be alone in our personal continuity. If our consciousness always finds a way to survive, does that mean that we're trapped in a reality where only we endure indefinitely while others fade away? This would imply a form of existential solitude, one where companionship and love and connections are transient illusions, momentary alignments of individual survival paths that will inevitably diverge. Is it possible that every person we have ever met exists only as a part of our own branching reality, never truly following the same path indefinitely? While these ideas might seem abstract, they align with the observable experience of death. We see it, but never feel it ourselves. The eternal step theory suggests that this isn't just an oddity of human existence, but more a fundamental rule of how consciousness interacts with the multiverse. Are you guys still following? If the eternal step theory suggests that consciousness always follows a path where survival is possible, does that mean it can continue indefinitely? Or is there a point where survival is no longer an option? What happens when the body is too aged or too damaged, or when all the possible lifelines are exhausted? In other words, does the road ever end? Or does the mind always find another step to take? One of the most challenging aspects of this theory is dealing with the biological decline. Unlike surviving car crashes, diseases, or near-death experiences, aging presents a slow, inevitable path towards the failure of the human body. If you keep surviving in an infinite series of branching points, does that mean you eventually reach an age where your body is completely incapable of functioning? Yet, you will still find a way forward. Some possibilities arise. The fractured self hypothesis. The mind begins to break down as well, meaning consciousness experiences gaps in continuity, essentially skipping through moments of lost perception. You may wake up one day and suddenly feel that years have passed in an instant, and this is with no recollection of prior moments. We also have the digital migration possibility. As technology advances, does consciousness shift into an artificial format in the universe where survival is still possible? Could the eternal step theory suggest an eventual transition into a post-human digital form? And thirdly, we have the quantum transition. If all biological survival routes end, could consciousness jump to an alternate existence that defies conventional understanding of life? If every step leads to continued survival, then logically there must always be some path forward. But what if a person reaches a scenario where no reality exists in which they continue? Does the eternal step theory break down right here? Or does it reveal a deeper nature of existence? There are a few ways this could be resolved. We have the reality loop back. Perhaps when all options run out, consciousness doesn't fade, it resets, finding itself back at a formative stage, possibly even in another life, another body, or another universe. Then we have the consciousness expand beyond physicality. If the survival becomes impossible for the biological sense, does the awareness itself persist in a non-physical state? We also have the final observer state. Some philosophies suggest that last moments of awareness is indefinitely stretched, so even if physical life ceases, the final moments of thoughts and perception extends endlessly in a way that we cannot currently comprehend. One of the most fascinating aspects of the silent end paradox is that it mirrors many cultural and religious ideas of the afterlife. If consciousness can never experience its own ending, does it mean it's fundamentally immortal? In the reincarnation hypothesis, could eternal step theory be a scientific explanation of the idea of rebirth? Does consciousness simply step into a new life once all the pathways in the old ones are exhausted? If you think about the last thought principle, many near-death experiences describe intense visions before fading away. Could this be the mind transitioning into another state where it continues on? Or the multiversal transition? If all life paths fail, does the mind shift to another universe entirely, with a new set of rules and physical laws? The eternal step theory challenges the ideas of finality, but it also opens the door to profound existential questions. If true, it suggests that personal experience never ceases, that we always find our way forward in some form or another. However, whether this is comforting or terrifying depends entirely on perspective. If consciousness always follows a path of survival, does that mean that we are actively choosing to live? Or are we simply being carried forward by an inevitable force? The eternal step theory challenged the idea of free will by suggesting that no matter what choice we make, we always end up on the same trajectory, one where we never experience death. But if every step that we take is one that must keep us alive, do we have any real agency in our own lives? Now, we could debate about the fate or free will. The concept of free will suggests that our decisions shape our reality, while fate implies that our paths are predetermined. The eternal step theory introduces a strange middle ground. Our choices may be free, but the ultimate outcome, our survival, is always guaranteed. Consider this. If you were to stand on the edge of a cliff and decide to jump, there might be an infinite number of branching realities where you either survived by some miraculous event or find a way not to jump at all. The version of reality where you actually die is one that you can never experience. This raises profound questions like, are we ever truly making choices? Or are we just navigating an endless flow of predetermined survival path? Some interpretations of quantum mechanics suggest that while the future is uncertain, it follows a set of probabilities. If the eternal step theory is true, then it would mean that even though our actions feel spontaneous, there is always a path forward where we continue to live. This would mean that the version of reality we experience is simply the most survivable one at any given moment. And if so, then free will might be an illusion. We may believe that we're making independent choices, but in reality, we are always following a singular path where our continue exist. If the theory holds, which it probably shouldn't because it was just a dream, but each of us is the sole immortal entity in our own version of reality. This means that from our perspective, we are the central figure in an unfolding story where the rules of probability always bends in our favor. This idea is eerily similar to the philosophical idea that only one's mind is sure to exist. And if true, this raises an even deeper question. If we are each confined to our own never-ending path, are we truly sharing a reality with others? Or are we alone in a world that adapts to our survival? The eternal step theory suggests that the feeling of choice may simply be a byproduct of an underlying multiversal rule, one that keeps us on a single, unbroken track of existence. If no individual ever truly experienced death from their own perspective, what does that mean for ethics? Does the eternal step theory justify reckless behavior, or does it create an even deeper sense of moral responsibility? A belief in personal immortality could have two conflicting effects. You could have the encouraging recklessness. This is if survival is guaranteed, would people take extreme risks without fear of consequence? Could this lead to a world where danger is ignored and human caution fades? Depending on our moral obligations, if others still die in our observed reality, does that mean that we bear greater responsibility for their well-being, knowing that we alone continue to exist in an unbroken survival path? And if survival is always assured, what does that mean for crime and for war or self-sacrifice? Would mortality shift if people internalize the idea that they could never experience death? Some possible ethical dilemmas include: would violent crime increase or decrease? If people believe they couldn't die, would acts of violence become meaningless, or would they be avoided altogether? What about the paradox of self-sacrifice? If someone sacrifices themselves for another, does that mean that their consciousness simply shifts to another timeline where they never made that sacrifice? If so, does self-sacrifice lose its meaning? Does punishment matter? If criminals always survive in their own perspective, does justice need to evolve in how it punishes or rehabilitates people? If you think about ethics of helping others, while you may never exist your own death, the people around you still appear to die. If we follow the logic of eternal step theory, those individuals are continuing to live their own survival branches, but in your observed reality, they are still gone. This raises the question, should we try to prevent harm, even if others technically never experience death from their own perspective? If the answer is yes, then that means that morality still holds power within the framework of eternal step theory. Even if consciousness never ends for anyone, the act of preventing suffering in this branch of reality still matters. Eternal step theory doesn't remove ethics. I think it reshapes it. If we take survival as a given, then morality isn't about avoiding death, but about making this version of reality meaningful for everyone involved. And how we act in our observed world still matters, even if the person ultimately steps forward into their own continued existence elsewhere. If you are always stepping forward into a new branch of reality where you survived, how do you know that you still are you? Memory is what connects our sense of self over time. But if consciousness is constantly shifting to a new survival path, could our perception of reality be an illusion designed to maintain a coherent personal narrative? Let's talk about the role of memory in a multiversal existence. Our memories shape who we are, but they are also notoriously unreliable. Studies in psychology shows that human memory is fallible, subject to distortion, omission, and even outright fabrications. If the eternal step theory would be true, and our consciousness is constantly moving to a timeline where we survive, then could the memory be adapting as well? If your consciousness shifts to a new timeline, does your brain suddenly adjust memories to make it feel like you have always been in this version of reality? Have you ever had a close call only to quickly forget the details? What if our minds suppress awareness of these transitions to maintain their psychological stability? How about déjà vus and false memories? Could the sensation of a déjà vu be a residual effect of shifting between survival timelines? Are some memories of past events actually from an alternate version of our own experience. Something that's been talked about quite a lot recently is the Mandela effect, the proof of reality shifts. The Mandela effect refers to collective false memories, situations where a large group of people remember events differently from recorded history. Could this phenomenon be evidence of slight shifts in reality, where some individuals retain partial memories from a previous survival branch? Examples include remembering movie lines differently, Luke, I am your father versus No, I am your father, or historical discrepancies, Nelson Mandela's death being misremembered by thousands of people. If consciousness is constantly shifting between survival paths, could some individuals retain a fragment of past realities that no longer exist? I would call this the fractured identity problem. Now, if you survive in one universe while another version of you dies in an alternate branch, what does that mean for your identity? Are you the same you that started your journey, or are you simply a continuation of the process that began at birth? And also, is there a core self? If reality constantly branches, is there an essential you? Or are you just a collection of experiences that persists across different survival paths? Could you merge with an alternate version of yourself? If infinite versions of you exist, are there moments where two timelines converge, creating the sensation of an abrupt shift in personality, or beliefs, or perspective? Does this explain personal changes? If you suddenly feel like a different person after a life-changing event, could this be because your consciousness has aligned with a slightly different version of yourself? The eternal step theory suggests that identity is fluid. It's shaped by survival and adaptation, but from our perspective, the self always feels unbroken because our perception is bound to a single, continuous experience. If the eternal step theory holds true, then survival isn't just about biology, it's about awareness. But what if consciousness itself is a fundamental aspect of reality? Something that continues beyond the limits of human body. Most mainstream scientific theories suggest that consciousness emerges from the brain, a byproduct of neural activity. But if consciousness always persists, even when the physical body should have perished, could it mean that awareness exists independently of the brain? In quantum mechanics, the observer effect suggests that an act of observing changes reality. Experiments like the double slit experiment shows that particles behave differently when they are being observed. Some physicists speculate that consciousness itself may play a direct role in shaping reality. If consciousness determines survival, does that mean it's fundamental to reality itself? Does the universe exist because it is observed? If so, could that explain why our awareness never fades? Could consciousness be an intrinsic property of the multiverse, persisting even when physical form is lost? What happens to consciousness when the body fails? If survival in the eternal step theory requires a living host, then what happens when no more biological pathway exists? Now, there's a few possibilities. Instead of dying, awareness shifts to an alternate version of reality where the body remains intact, no matter how improbable. It could be called consciousness transfers. Another thing could be called consciousness adapts. When biological life becomes impossible, awareness moves into a non-physical state or integrates with a new form of existence, for example digital or energetic or otherwise. But consciousness could also merge. So if individual survival paths exist for everyone, could multiple consciousness converge into a collective awareness at the end of all physical options? Do this explain the near-death experiences? Many people who have had the near-death experiences, and NDEs, report similar sensations. A feeling of detachment from the body, or moving through a tunnel of light, or a sense of peace and continued awareness, seeing loved ones who have passed on. If consciousness never experienced death directly, could NDEs be the mind momentarily perceiving the transition of another survival branch? Are these glimpses into the process of stepping forward into a new reality? Some scientific theories propose that consciousness is not confined to individual brains, but instead a fundamental property of the universe, like gravity or electromagnetism. This includes ideas such as the belief that consciousness is a basic feature of reality. Integrated information theory suggests that consciousness arises from the way information it is structured in a system, meaning it could exist in multiple forms beyond the human brain. You have the simulation theory that suggests that reality is a form of programmed experience. Could consciousness be the only real thing moving through different versions of simulation as it survives? The eternal step theory would suggest that personal experience never ceases, that there is always a next step forward. But if consciousness is fundamental to reality, does that mean it's eternal in all senses? Could it be that awareness itself is the only thing that truly exists, shaping the multiverse as it moves forward? If you're still here, then we will explore the concept of destiny, miracles, and how seemingly impossible events do fit into the eternal step theory. If survival is always assured, does that mean that fate is real? Or is it just probability at work? If the eternal step theory suggests that consciousness always follows a path where survival is possible, then how do we explain situations where survival seems not just improbable, but impossible? Are extreme cases of survival merely statistic anomalies, or do they indicate something deeper, something that could be interpreted as fate? Many cultures through history have beliefs in destiny, the idea that each person have a predetermined path. But if eternal step theory is true, then destiny may not be about a plan designed by a higher power, but rather the inevitable unfolding of the only timeline we are able to experience, the one that we survive. Throughout history, there have been stories of miraculous survivals. People who have walked away from plane crashes, terminal illnesses, or catastrophic disasters against all odds. From an external perspective, these events are regarded as either divine intervention, or sheer luck, or statistic anomalies. But from an eternal step perspective, they are simply inevitable. To go a bit deeper, if an event has even the tiniest chance of allowing survival, then in some branch of reality it must happen. What we call a miracle may simply be an extremely low probability survival path that was bound to be experienced by the observer. So what does this mean for religion? Does the idea of an unbroken survival path reinforce religious beliefs in divine protection, or does it eliminate the need for external intervention? Do we have a plot armor in our own reality? The idea of a plot armor is often used in fiction to describe how the main characters always seem to survive, no matter how dangerous the situation is. Now, eternal step theory suggests that we all have this plot armor within our own consciousness experience. No matter how impossible the odds, if even one reality exists where we continue to live, that is the one that we experience. But this does raise even more questions and definitely an interesting dilemma. Why do some people experience more improbable survival events than others? Are some individuals just predisposed to following stranger, more miraculous paths? Does this mean that people who live through extreme circumstances are special in some way? Or is it just the nature of probability that someone has to end up in those branches of reality? How does this affect our view of randomness? If we only ever experience the reality where we survive, does that mean that there's no such thing as true randomness in our own perspective? If survival is guaranteed, does it mean every risk is worth taking? Now logically, no. Even though consciousness follows a survival path, the quality of that survival is not guaranteed. This means that while you may always continue, you could find yourself in path of extreme suffering, disability, or even hardship. In this sense, taking unnecessary risk can lead to realities where survival is no longer pleasant. This leads to new understanding of risk and probability. Survival is certain, but comfort is not. Miraculous events are only surprising from an external viewpoint. Fate is simply the path that remains after all other collapse. If we always survive in our own experience, does that mean that we are free to shape our own destiny? Or are we simply following a single unbroken road where survival is inevitable? Now this is where the eternal step theory blurs the line between randomness and fate, because while we may feel like we are making choices, we are ultimately only able to follow the timeline where we continue to exist. If people truly believe in the eternal step theory, how would it change their action, their choices, and overall approach to life? Would they live with greater confidence, take more risks, or become indifferent to danger? The psychological impact of such belief would be profound, potentially reshaping personal ambitions, also societal structures, and even the way we process fear and grief. One of the most immediate change in human behavior would likely be the reduction or even elimination of fear of death. If individuals truly accepted that their consciousness will always shift to a timeline where they continue to live, their attitude towards risk and danger might change in a few ways. It can either be fearlessness. People take bold actions, unafraid of potential life-threatening consequences, and this could lead to an increase in adventurous pursuit, innovation, and self-confidence. But it could also be recklessness. Some might take unnecessary risks, believing that they are invincible. Extreme sports and thrill-seeking behaviors and even criminal acts could become more common as people test the limits of their survival. Now, would society need to create new ethical guidelines to prevent people from engaging in self-destructive behavior simply because they believe they cannot die? Also, if everyone is living in their own unbroken survival path, what does that mean for our emotional connection to others? The idea that death is an illusion might make loss feel less final, but also make love and grief and empathy weaker. Greater emotional detachment would be if people believe that their loved ones will always survive in another timeline. Would they grieve less deeply? Alternatively, knowing that existence is continuous might inspire greater appreciation for each moment shared with others, reinforcing the importance of meaningful relationships. And would society view relationships differently if life was seen as an unbreakable experience rather than an infinite journey? Many religions are built around the concept of an afterlife, reincarnation, or spiritual continuation beyond death. If the eternal step theory were widely accepted, would it reinforce religious beliefs or contradict them? If consciousness always continues, could eternal step theory be a scientific explanation for reincarnation? If survival is always assured, does it remove the need for religious doctrines based on fear of death and the promise of an afterlife? Could this theory give rise to new philosophies where individuals see their own continuous existence as a part of a greater cosmic process? If a majority of people believe in the eternal step theory, how would it change the way society function? Some possibilities could include the legal and justice system. Would the concept of life sentences or capital punishment become obsolete if people believed in an unbroken survival path? Would people care less about health and longevity if they assumed survival was guaranteed in same form? Would conflict become more or less frequent if people no longer fear death? Whether or not eternal step theory is objectively true, its impact on human psychology and behavior could be profound. Believing in an unbroken survival path might change the way we live, the way we love, and perceive the world. But would this belief lead to a more fearless and fulfilled society, or one that descends into recklessness and detachment? The eternal step theory challenged everything that we think about life, death, and consciousness. If we never experience our own death, if we always follow the path where we survive, what does that mean for the way we live? Now we have explored the scientific, the philosophical, and psychological implication of this idea, and now we have to ask, what does this mean for us as individuals? Is life truly infinite from our perspective? If consciousness never ends, then what we perceive as a life is a continuous, unbroken journey through infinite variations of survival. Another question is, are we alone in our survival? If everyone experiences their own unbroken path, does that mean that our experience is fundamentally solitary, even as we interact with others? Do we have control over reality? If we always step into the path of survival, do we shape our own fate? Or are we simply following a determined route? And what happens when all paths end? The continuous must always continue, but does it transition into something beyond our understanding? A new existence, a new universe, a new form entirely. The eternal step theory could be seen as both liberating and terrifying. On one hand, it suggests that we are truly immortal from our own perspective. We are free from the fear of an ending. On the other hand, it raises profound questions about the nature of reality, identity, and the meaning of existence. And how we interpret this theory comes down to perspective as well. If you see it as freedom, then life becomes an adventure where every experience and every risk and every decision is just a part of an endless journey. If you see it as a burden, then the idea of infinite survival might feel like an inescapable loop, an eternity with no rest. And if you see it as a mystery, then it invites exploration and opportunity to push the boundaries of science, philosophy, and consciousness itself. So what comes next? If the eternal step theory is correct, which it probably isn't, because it's just a dream, but then there is no ending. There is only the next step, and the next step, and the next step. Whether we choose to embrace it or fear it or challenge it, one thing would be certain: we are already on that path, and welcome to the journey. And remember, no matter what happens, you will always wake up in a world where you survived. But I digress. This was just a dream I had, that I put some time and thoughts into. It probably holds no reality or truth, but I guess it's also impossible to know. And the best way to think about this is through your own feelings and mind, just the way that I did. And I hope this was interesting and perhaps eye-opening for some of your own ideas and thoughts. And I see you guys again.